Welcome to Crash Course, a podcast about business, political, and social disruption, and what we can learn from it. I'm Tim O'Brien. Today's Crash Course, Florida versus Young Minds. Name a flashpoint in the U.S. culture wars, and then think about how it intersects with education, and you're sure to find Florida. The state's governor, Ron DeSantis, is a devoted and ubiquitous culture warrior who appears to be mulling a presidential bid. And he has put the public education of Florida's children, teenagers, and college students on the front lines of a battle over what is and isn't appropriate for the classroom. The stakes, as DeSantis has defined them, involve preserving parents' prerogatives, curtailing harmful discussions of race, gender, and historical injustices, or wokism in his description, and reasserting the state's right to be an educational arbiter. DeSantis' critics, myself among them, say his policies are retrogressive and benighted, and undermine students' understanding of their own bodies, minds, histories, and place in the world. A lot of policies have been in play in all of this. Today we're going to focus on contentious debates around how two subjects are taught: African American history and sex education. Joining me today are Marlon Williams-Clark, a high school social studies teacher in Florida, and Lisa Jarvis, a science columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. And we'll start with Marlon. Greetings, Marlon.
Hello.
Marlon, you were born in Florida and you were raised there. What made you want to become a teacher?
Well, I will say that it wasn't my first option for a career. I had always wanted to be a sports and entertainment lawyer. However, somewhere in college, I was in public relations and communications, and it seemed that everybody around me knew that I would be a teacher except me. So it was one of those callings type of thing. And, you know, it's not the best pay, but I do enjoy what I do. I enjoy interacting with my students and watching them, seeing their faces when they are enlightened on new knowledge or they see things differently.
And how long have you been teaching now?
This is my 11th year teaching. Tell
me briefly the name of the school you teach, where it's located, and describe the school a little bit to me.
I teach at Florida State University Schools in Tallahassee, Florida. It is a research lab school under the governance of Florida State University. I teach high school social studies, African American history. As far as the demographics for the school, the demographics imitate the demographic population of Florida.
So what are the demographics of the school then? Like, how does it break down?
Some rough numbers. It's about 70-ish% white, about 20% Black or African American, maybe closer to 15%. And then the rest is split between Hispanic, Latino populations and Asian populations.
So fairly reflective of the country at large. Not exact, but more or less in the same zone.
Yes.
And how would you describe your experience as a teacher overall?
My experiences have been great for the most part. I will say that there has been a change, I guess, as far as like self-censorship and how far you can go. And this was even prior to laws that have been passed in Florida to make it that way. But, you know, even around the time of the election or the 2016 campaign season, it became tougher to be a social studies teacher, especially for one like me, where it's heavy on class discussions. And, you know, my number one rule is respect yourself, respect others, respect our facilities, but allowing a space for students to be able to speak freely and learn from each other. And so I would often have debates. And around that time, it became very apparent that I couldn't do debates anymore. It was becoming too contentious in the classroom.
What sort of set that in motion?
Well, as you spoke about the culture wars that are happening right now, I would say that at the time where former President Trump was the front runner, there became this hard split of where students stood. And you could see what households believed what, because it filtered into the classroom. And so in having those discussions, and I've been pretty good about moderating discussions and assuring that everybody is respected and feels safe. I guess it was a reflection of what was happening in the political spectrum of this nastiness that existed. And so the debates, which prior to, my students would have debates on contentious topics that people have strong opinions about, but everybody was respectful. And then at that particular time, it seemed that the respect was leaving, and it was, everybody in their corners. And so I made a decision just to not do debates anymore. And of course, that was me teaching U.S. history. And now I teach, like, all 5 of my classes are now African-American history.
So at the time in 2016, how long had you been doing debates in your classroom prior to 2016? Had you been doing them for several years?
Since I started teaching.
And they had never become contentious before? They had never sort of split into us versus them arguments?
No, it was not a nastiness. Like, people would stand their ground in their opinions, but it was a respectful debate. And then it became a point where I was like, I guess I'm going to have to stop this,
And you would attribute that to the dynamics around the 2016 election itself?
That's what I think it was, without actually doing research and, analyzing it and everything. That's what it seemed to be, because I had not experienced that as a teacher prior to that point, where it was these hard lines were drawn in the classroom.
And did you feel after 2016, did those lines get drawn even harder up until the present date?
I don't know. Like I said, I stopped doing debates in the classroom to try to avoid those type of situations. Now, I will say in my African-American history class, it is an elective course. So my students that are enrolled because they want to be in the class. They want to engage with the information. So it creates a different dynamic for discussions. We don't really have any debates, but we do have discussions around topics. And it's very respectful. And you can tell that all of the students are really wanting to learn. And I've witnessed where they've learned from each other when they're bringing their own personal and cultural experiences to the discussion.
Now, I want to zero in on a recent experience you've had that attracted my attention, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show. You were also a member of a pilot program that the College Board, a nonprofit that develops standardized tests and curricula for college, set up last year to introduce a multidisciplinary advanced placement high school course in African American history. Tell me, how did you get invited to join that pilot program?
A mentor teacher of mine, she was teaching the African American history classes here at the school. And I believe it was the principal who applied for the school to be a pilot school. And then my mentor teacher ended up taking another job. And so I ended up taking it up. And so went to the Summer Institute for the course, the AP Institute in Washington, D.C. in July. And it's just kind of been blowing up from there.
How did the class go? How did you enjoy teaching it? And how did the students respond to it?
I loved it. First of all, this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And the reaction of my students when we would engage in some of the topics that were mentioned in the pilot guide, they were very into it. Of course, it's an AP level course, so there were some extensive readings, but everything also was, again, in the pilot, so things would change. They didn't like some of the reading all the time, but they very much loved the topics and being able to engage in it and bringing from the different readings. And you could see where students, in a sense, they were being affirmed, particularly my African-American students, where there wasn't a course for them to really engage in African-American history in that way. And so, one of the discussions earlier on in the school year was a lesson that peeled off of Henry Louis Gates' essay, 42 Million Ways to Be Black. And so we just kind of went through the discussion. And
tell our audience what the thrust of that essay is.
Well, the key takeaway from it was we read it and I started the discussion with, just throwing out there, what does it mean to be Black? And so, of course, you heard stereotypical things. You heard things that people personally believe. You heard things that people have experienced with Black people or things in popular culture. And I also threw up different pictures of different people in society. So, one of them was Kanye West and Candace Owens. And so it really pushed them to think that there is no singular way to be Black. Blackness cannot be defined in a singular way. And we came away with that is that if you are Black and you are walking and moving around in this world, then that is the way to be Black.
So you were asking provocative questions about core subjects around identity.
Yes.
How did the white students in the class feel about it?
They were very engaged. And if it was something that they were not sure on, they would sit back and listen. And if they had questions, they would ask. And so those were the moments that I would see my white students learning from my black students. But then on the flip side, I would see my black students learning from my white students, because there isn't a lot of opportunity to have an informed discussion, to ask questions without worrying about somebody getting offended or lashing out at you. And so it just really provided a way for them to discuss with each other. And so like the white students would say, these are the things that I experienced. I have questions about this. And, the black students would answer those questions. And so it was really a nice moment to see them learning from each other, because as we can see in our society, there's a lot of adults that can't have those conversations, sit down and have those conversations today.
So imagine that, a classroom with provocative questions, people having a civil dialogue about potentially thorny topics and growing as people. What more could we want out of a classroom? Well, we're going to find out. Marlon, I want to pause our conversation right there for a moment so we can hear from our sponsor, and then we will come right back to you. We're back with Marlon Williams-Clark, a high school social studies teacher in Florida. There were other topics as well that got attention, and some fault lines started to emerge around those outside your classroom, right?
Correct.
Tell me about some of the other topics that became contentious.
My experience for when we were doing the pilot was very positive. I had a lot of support from parents. I had support from administration. I had support from other teachers, because it was also helping to fill in some gaps for other classes. I don't know, particularly from what my standpoints of what those thorny topics would have been that people would have had problems with, because we didn't have problems with it. And so the only criticisms that I have heard have come from those who are in power. It has not come from community people.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Drafts of possible content of the classes emerged. There were elements of it that some took issue with. Critical race theory was seen as a devastating topic that was pervading the entire curriculum. The Black Lives Matter movement was part of the curriculum. Some people took issue with that being taught. The notion of reparations for slavery and its associated depredations was considered beyond the pale. Queer studies was part of this. People had issues with whether or not your population of students should be taught that. The College Board continued to revise this curriculum in conversations with parents and local school boards and teachers. But then in January, Governor DeSantis said he would ban the curriculum entirely. And then the Florida State Board of Education let the College Board know that it was unhappy too, and went as far as to say that the AP studies class you were teaching, quote, significantly lacks educational value. That invited some more infighting, and then the College Board watered down the curriculum further. Tell me your thoughts about all of that. When that started happening, how did you feel about that?
Well, first, personally, it was quite offensive as a Black man in America who is not only passionate about this particular subject matter, but passionate about the fact that my history should be taught just as much as anybody else's. And when it came out saying that it lacked significant educational value, or, with things about critical race theory, which is not taught in K-12 schools. I'm currently working on my doctorate, and even when working on my master's, I hadn't heard anything about critical race theory until my doctorate studies.
Which historically has been where it's been taught at the college level or even at the postgraduate level. It's really not pervading America's kindergartens, is it?
No, it's not. Not at all. And so it's just become this, in my personal opinion, CRT, critical race theory, has become this stamp for broader things that people don't want to talk about. And so when we look at African-American history, it has always been contentious. Even when Carter G. Woodson, who is known as the father of Black history, as he started Negro History Week and then later on changed to Black History Month, When he was trying to push for African American or Black studies courses to be at HBCUs in the 30s and the 40s, there was rejection from HBCU administrators. When we look at the 1960s, when Black students protested to get Black studies into predominantly white schools, there was a pushback against it. So anytime that you are trying to include more about the Black experience, there's going to be pushback. And my reason, or why I believe that, is because to really critically look at Black history means to hold up a mirror to America that some people don't want to look at. They rather have a mirror without a reflection. And when the state government, the Department of Education came out with their reasons, and when they put out the specific lessons that they had an issue with, I went back to look at my pilot guide. They were not there. So I don't know where they got their information from. Perhaps it was from an earlier draft of the course prior to the giving the pilot guide to the teachers that were piloting the course, but they weren't there. And, they talk about the reparations movement. Well, guess what? Black history is so linked to racism and racial violence. And so there is a legitimate
and
question.
Financial exploitation.
Yeah, and financial exploitation. So there is a legitimate question about reparations, especially when we look at, we go back to U.S. history and we talk about Japanese people being given reparations for the internment camps during the World War II. So I feel that the reasoning for pushing back is for their own personal political beliefs.
And you're saying not in the interest of exploring difficult topics that might help our youngsters' minds grow?
Absolutely not. Again, I'm going to keep saying this is my personal opinion and not a reflection of any organization I'm a part of, but they say they're pushing back against critical race theory. I personally feel like they're pushing against critical thinking. They don't want the kids to think critically about subjects. And, how Black history is taught on the surface level. We're not going to really talk about the fact that the hard history of learning about where people of African descent came from to this part of the world, the back-breaking work they did to build this country. Then there was the Civil War, which they would rather have the narrative that it was not about slavery. I said, well, anybody that says that it's not about slavery did not look at the manifesto of the Confederate States. They were very explicit with what they meant. Then they don't want to talk about the hard part of Reconstruction and what followed after that. They'd rather talk about Martin Luther King and him having a dream, but they also don't want to talk about the real Martin Luther King, who actually said America owes Black people a check.
And let's remind our listeners that Martin Luther King got shot.
Correct.
After this whole battle emerged around the AP course and what should and shouldn't be taught about African American history, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis banned it and then went even further. He subsequently offered his own proposal to overhaul higher education by emphasizing courses on, quote unquote, Western civilization. How did you interpret that? And where do you see some of that leading when governors are saying this is the curriculum that should be taught and it should only be about a certain, say, swim lane of studies?
I think it's new language for white supremacy. I've made jokes with friends. I said, you want to see some creativity? Look at white supremacy. There have been some very creative laws in order to uphold that particular power structure. He once said also that white students shouldn't feel uncomfortable or discomfort when learning about history. That totally negates or neglects the feelings of Black and brown students sitting in history classes for so long, especially Black students, where it's almost like you don't have any history of how much of U.S. history is taught because there's so much left out about the African-American experience. For him to go that route and also to try to overhaul the higher education system, I think it's very short-sighted. Dr. Maya Angelou said, when people show you who they are, believe them. And I'm believing him for who he is showing himself to be. I think it's very short-sighted because it's going to disrupt and lower the rankings of our Florida colleges and universities. And it's not making our K-12 system any stronger, going back and forth with College Board and then proposing to perhaps just do away with College Board altogether. I'm guessing that's under the assumption that every Florida student wants to go to a Florida school for college. It's just very unfortunate.
You raise an important thing. For those kids who may think they can't get the education they need in Florida, they'd have to look to other states. And that's becoming a troubling landscape as well. Last year alone, at least 36 states, most of them led by Republican legislatures, introduced more than 130 bills that sought to limit how history, gender, and race are taught. So this issue obviously has traction well beyond Florida, even if DeSantis has become the movement's most visible standard bearer. What does that mean to you as an educator, given that these things you've been wrestling with in Florida are occurring in other states as well?
Well, I guess I would first respond to that by saying education doesn't just exist within the classrooms. And by pushing laws like this, what they are showing is the reason why we should have courses like this. And like I said, Black history has always been contentious. Whenever we talk about the history of slavery in America, it has been contentious. The Daughters of the Confederacy did an entire campaign to change how textbooks talked about slavery, to make it that it was this nice system and slave masters were nice to their slaves and the slaves enjoyed being in slavery. Our own governor here in Florida said that nobody was worried about slavery or freeing slaves until the Revolutionary War. What about the revolts and the rebellions and all of the enslaved people who continuously tried to run away? It's very troubling. I think it's a reflection on the fact that our country's history has not been told in a holistic way, but more in a propagandic way. And so anyone or any organization that tries to do away with the propaganda to give a holistic view of what makes America America, there's a pushback because some people are uncomfortable with having to face the fact that America became the power structure that it is on some things that we try to teach our children not to be like.
You know, it seems to me that the overarching issue and focus here is this. What's an education, and what does it mean to be an educated person? So help me with those. How would you answer those questions? Let's start with the first one. What is an education?
An education for me is to be enlightened. A lot of times when I talk about this, I talk about it from the standpoint of a Black man in America and a descendant of enslaved people who were legally forced not to get an education. So that tells us already that education is a way to success, a way to enlightenment, a way to self-dignity. It's kind of like the foundation to freedom. Now, what does it mean to be an educated person? To be an educated person is to be an inquirer, an inquisitor, a curious person. That's something I always push my students to be curious, because I also know that a lot of students don't like history. They think it's boring. But I always teach them that you have to approach history and other subjects with curiosity. You got to have some questions and try to find out why.
So I've got one last question for you. We always ask our guests what they've learned from a disruptive moment that they're involved with. And tell me, what have you learned from watching this debate unfold around African American studies in Florida?
Well, I think what I have learned is that people are okay with ignorance. And it's very disturbing and unfortunate, but it does seem that people rather not really engage in information. They want to go by how they feel. And that's fine. Everybody's entitled to their feelings. And as you say in therapy, your feelings are valid. However, there's these things that we call facts. There is primary sources. There are things that put in place what is fact and what is, your feelings. I've learned that there is more of a willingness by younger people to engage in this information than it is in people that are older. And that's not to paint, all older people. I'm 35 going on 36. But I think it is a reflection of how we have been as a society for so long. And we are seeing the results of not addressing things of the past.
Marlon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Marlon Williams-Clark is a teacher at Florida State University Schools. You can follow him on Twitter at Marlon-WMS-Clark. We're going to take a break to hear from one of our sponsors, and when we return, we'll be joined by Lisa Jarvis. And we're back with Lisa Jarvis, a science columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and someone we're very lucky to have in our ranks. Hey, Lisa, welcome to Crash Course.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I'm happy to be here.
You wrote a very compelling column recently, Lisa. The headline was, Florida bill would make puberty even more awkward. So tell us about the bill and then tell us a little bit about your column.
Right. There's a lot to unpack about Florida Bill 1069, which is one of a cluster of bills that the Florida legislature is trying to pass that would put boundaries on what you can and can't discuss in public schools. This particular bill targets a lot of things. Like many others, it sort of hinges on the idea of whether or not you can discuss sexual identity and use pronouns in school. But then it goes further and tries to put boundaries on sex education. Whether or not students should receive instruction on human sexuality, including STIs, sexually transmitted diseases, before the 6th grade. What got me particularly incensed with this particular bill was that includes discussion of menstruation. So by the time most kids have reached 6th grade, they're 12. And the average age that most girls have their first period is 11 years and 9 months. So that means that half of the kids who are in this class would not be allowed to ask their teacher any questions about menstruation. I'm really frustrated by this. It feels like a real step backwards. We've reached a point in society where we're much more open about our bodies, embracing, all of the changes that kids go through during puberty. And this shuts that down. A lot of kids get their first period in school, and so I just keep imagining what it would be like for a young girl to not have a trusted adult that they could ask what was going on, let alone have gotten that information from an adult ahead of time.
Let's stop on one point you just brought up that I think's very interesting to zero in on, which is this idea that we've gotten more comfortable in our society talking about our bodies and our biology and all the attendant things that come with that. I could imagine some people saying, well, maybe easy for you to talk about that, but not easy for me. So where do we draw the lines around that? What's a healthy way to think about when it is and isn't appropriate to talk about some of those things in a classroom, for example?
I guess my feeling is that I understand that parents want to have some level of control over when their kids learn certain information. One thing I think is very important to point out is that most states do have laws that allow parents to opt out of sex education. And so I think passing laws that then preclude everyone else from getting that information is troublesome to me. But, I understand that some parents may feel differently about the amount and extent of information kids should know. I think there's a lot of good data to support the idea that just normalizing talking about our bodies doesn't lead to behavior that those parents are worried about, And so I think giving kids information is really important, and school is an important partner in that. Just understanding, for example, the names of your body parts and the process of puberty, it's hard for me to understand why that could ever be a problem for someone to know what's going to happen to their body.
Yeah, I'm reminded of those famous 2 words, know thyself.
Yeah, I understand that everyone may not be on the same spectrum of me in terms of openness with my, own child or what I think should happen in schools in terms of understanding your body. But I just feel like information is empowering, and it's confusing to me that we would be preventing kids from having the information they need to understand themselves and make good decisions.
And is this particular battle that you wrote about, is this unique to Florida?
It's not. I think we've seen a slide backwards. Data from the Guttmacher Institute shows that overall kids have been receiving less sex education in the last 5 years since 1995. That's astonishing to me. I was this age in the 80s and went to Catholic school where sex education became a part of the curriculum. And so it's sort of astounding to me to see that we would be going backwards with this. A lot of the conversations, again, hinge on this discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity, or where there's a perception that kids are being given information too young. But it's not just Florida. I think there's a push in a lot of states to return to a place of abstinence-only education and set boundaries around what information kids receive at what age at all, if anything at all.
Yeah, since we're aging ourselves together on this show, I will note that I was in Catholic grade school in the 1970s and I had sex education.
Yeah, I have a very distinct memory of the weekend-long workshop sex education workshop that I took when I was in Catholic school in the 80s. And, I think there was an acknowledgement that it's important for kids to understand their bodies and have information and be able to use the right language to talk about it.
I really like this paragraph from your column, and I want to read it out loud for our listeners. As the mom of a tween girl, I'm constantly amazed by the wealth of resources about periods and puberty on the market these days. While my generation had dog-eared copies of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, my daughter and her peers are lucky enough to have an entire shelf full of body-positive books. That sure sounds like progress to me, but it obviously sounds like dangerous thinking to some other folks. Why do you think that is?
Again, I have to go back to this constant attention to gender identity and sexual orientation. It seems like it starts there and then creeps into other areas. And a lot of the books do cover this topic, but I am not sure I understand why having good information about your body is threatening. I thought it was good timing for us to have this conversation because just a week ago, the movie version of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret came out, and I went with a gaggle of tween girls to see it this last weekend. And it was a reminder to me, a good refresher of what was in the book and what it was about, which was really just about puberty and the awkwardness of being a kid and trying to figure yourself out. And so it's hard for me to think that children benefit from not having the right information to navigate that process.
And this isn't just an issue that's in play in schools. Corporate America recognizes that the world is evolving too, doesn't it? Talk to me a little bit about CVS's product line for tweens.
CVS Health, and I hope others follow suit, last year said that they would cut the price of their period products by 25%, which was an acknowledgement that women pay a pink tax, is what they like to call it. Essentially, this is something that is an unavoidable part of being a human, and these are expensive. I have gotten requests from my daughter's school to send in period products because not everyone can afford them. And so kids need them in schools, teachers are handing them out. So I think whatever we can do to make these things more accessible, corporate America recognizes that it's in demand.
Lisa, we've talked about how some state governments view the sex education debate, as well as how some corporations view it. What about parents and the role they play? I liked this from your column, offering guidance for adults. We should be making these conversations easier, not harder, for all the trusted adults in a child's life. Adults can't take all the awkwardness out of puberty, but we can make it easier by giving kids the knowledge they need to navigate it. Maybe this is too sweeping and hard to answer, but where do you see most parents landing in this particular discussion?
It's possible that I'm drawing from a biased pool of parents, but I do feel like there's an understanding that kids need to have the right language to talk about their bodies. That matters on a lot of different levels. One is just releasing the stigma and shame around really natural things that we all go through. Half of the world gets a period, So it's odd to me that we would be so worried about talking about it. But I also have been covering a lot of issues around teen mental health lately. And one of the things that we saw in some recent data from the CDC, which does a survey every year of teens' risk behaviors, is that more girls are experiencing sexual violence. And one thing that I think is important to understand about sex education is that it's not just about teaching kids what is sex. It's about teaching kids how to draw boundaries, how to be respectful. This idea of body positivity is about all of us being able to be respectful of one another. I personally think that's really important. I would think that most parents would want their kid to have the right language, to be able to say no, to understand what no means. Those are important conversations that start happening early in a lot of schools that have sex education throughout all of, say, fourth grade and up.
We were speaking with our previous guest about the debate in Florida over African American studies, and I think of that as almost a hearts and minds discussion. And sex ed is about the body, and in some ways it offers parallels to discussions about reproductive rights, the abortion pill, and how individual rights intersect with the Constitution and the authority of the state, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. I think in both cases, there's an effort to justify a desire to control people's bodily autonomy, to me, under the guise of protecting children. That feels very clear when it comes to abortion, because there's lots of people who believe that, right or wrong, they are protecting an unborn child in their efforts to have these abortion bans. Bills like this one in Florida are also sold as protecting children from ideas that parents and legislators believe are dangerous. It also feels like it's worth drawing a parallel between the very real consequences of these bills for the people on the other end of them, right? Of course, we understand what that means when it comes to abortion bans. That leads to unintended births, and I don't think there's enough conversations among lawmakers in a time of rising maternal mortality on how we're going to keep pregnant people safe if they can't get an abortion, or, ensuring that families have all the resources they need to raise healthy kids. I think there's a parallel there to sex ed, where I don't think it's a stretch to say that there's real consequences to not arming kids with the information they need. We know, for example, that abstinence-only education doesn't work. It's not an effective way to prevent pregnancies and STIs. I just mentioned this idea that sex education covers a broad range of topics, whether that's understanding boundaries, how to navigate sexual violence, how to talk about those things and putting a language behind them, how to understand self-image and navigate social media is another part of sex education. To me, there's very real consequences in both situations to using these laws to prevent people from having that kind of bodily autonomy.
And what have you learned from these recent battles over the body and what it says about the state and individual rights?
I mean, I struggle because it feels to me like there's a somewhat infuriating contradiction going on right now. Laws are being introduced under the guise of protecting parental rights. Laws like this that want to pare back access to information about sexual health. But at the same time, in some of those same states, for example, Florida, those states are trying to pass laws that could, for example, take a child away from a parent who is allowing their child to undergo gender-affirming care. So it feels contradictory to me to sort of say parents know best, but then also parents don't know best, and the state knows best. I don't understand the kind of logic of the kind of collection of laws that are being passed.
Lisa, we are already out of time. That went by really quickly. Will you come back again sometime?
I would love to, of course.
You can read Lisa Jarvis's fine work on Bloomberg Opinion, and you can follow her on Twitter at Lisa M. Jarvis. Here at Crash Course, we believe that collisions can be messy, impressive, challenging, surprising, and always instructive. In today's Crash Course, I learned that while knowledge may be power, there's a lot of powerful people who don't want us to have certain forms of knowledge. And that's confusing. What did you learn? We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at the Bloomberg Opinion handle, @opinion, or me, @Tim O'Brien, using the hashtag Bloomberg Crash Course. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you're listening right now. And please leave us a review. It helps more people find this show. This episode was produced by the indispensable Anna Mazarakis, Moses Andam, and me. Our supervising producer is Magnus Henriksen, and we had editing help from Sage Bauman, Katie Boyce, Jeff Grocott, Mike Nitza, and Christine Vanden Beilard. Blake Maples does our sound engineering, and our original theme song was composed by Luis Guerra. I'm Tim O'Brien. We'll be back next week with another Crash Course.